So today's lecture is about determinism, and we will be looking at several areas of it. We'll be looking at, for instance, a definition of determinism. We'll start by defining what determinism is, what it implies on for human nature. We'll see how determinism and human nature can be examined, and then we will look at human action and the laws of nature, how these can be perhaps made compatible when we talk of free will. Keep in mind that determinism seems to be the opposite of free will. Now, as we progress with the lecture, this distinction will come, will be brought out more distinctly, but we'll also see a position that is called compatibilism, and that, as the name implies, as the name seems to suggest, free will and determinism can sometimes, up to a certain point, be made compatible. And then finally we'll look at the implications of determinism. Now, let's start with a definition of determinism. And as the concept suggests, as the name suggests, determinism is about things being somehow pre-written or pre-arranged or pre-affected, so to speak. So you have something that is already written, in a sense. So in its broadest sense, determinism suggests that all events, physical events, scientific events in a sense, but also moral events, moral decisions that we take, are determined by causes that have already existed. So you have the event, and previous to that event, you had the causes that led to that event. And the idea of determinism then is predicated on the idea that the universe has certain laws, certain rules. These laws and rules are consistent, and given a specific set of circumstances, therefore, only one outcome would be possible. It's a position that challenges a number of other things. It challenges free will, for instance. The idea that we can make decisions unhindered or unaffected, essentially free decisions. That is why it's called free will. When we think that we, being autonomous agents, we can decide for ourselves. And determinism somehow affects that view. It challenges that view. It challenges also notions such as randomness, that things can happen randomly, because randomness seems to go against the very idea of determinism. If something is determined, it's already been planned out how it will act. Randomness flies in the face of that. And therefore determinism predicts or asserts that everything can be predicted. At least in principle, if not always in practice, but at least in principle we can know from before, we can predict what the outcome of something will be, in principle. Now let me dive a bit deeper in this. When I say that we can predict, that something can be predicted in principle, if I'm a hard determinist, that is, if I hold a mostly perhaps extreme position on determinism, that I believe that everything is determined, whether I then understand the causes of something or not doesn't change the fact that everything is determined. And therefore that would be the challenge that is posed therefore by determinism. Now there are several types of determinism. There is causal determinism, and this would be the most common form of determinism. And when you have causal determinism, you have every event that necessarily is brought about by preceding events and conditions. Then you have logical determinism, which focuses on concepts of truth and knowledge, and therefore the way also we think. It's bound to rationality, etc. And then we have theological determinism. Now let's examine this a bit deeper, all three of them. So causal determinism, like I said, it's a form of determinism that is also the most common, and it posits that every event necessarily is preceded by other events, other conditions that work in conjunction with the laws of nature. And usually when we talk of causal determinism, it's a type of determinism that is closely linked to the physical sciences, and this idea that is found very often in scientific experiments, etc., where you're studying causes and effects. You're studying the idea of the cause and the effect. Logical determinism, like I said, it's focused mostly on truth and knowledge, and causal determinism then is a type of determinism that suggests that if something is true, then the fact that it is true has to have been determined before it was known. Whether you know something or not to be true doesn't change the fact that it is true. That is logical determinism. So, for example, the truth about a future event, some future event, is already determined and knowable in principle. It's logically knowable. You can arrive to that knowledge through the use of knowledge. In a sense, when we do logic and we study different types of arguments, but as you know, we cover, for instance, inductive and deductive argumentation. Deductive arguments are this. Deductive arguments are forms of arguments that lead to a conclusion that can't be otherwise if it's valid and sound. That would be because the conclusion is, in a certain sense, logically determined. Now, the third type of determinism that I've mentioned would be theological determinism. And as the name suggests, theology, the study of God, study of religions, etc. And therefore, this type of determinism has its roots in religion. It's contextual in a sense. Its foundations are contextual to religion, or to religious contexts. And theological determinism then would suggest that all events have been predetermined, have been pre-written by some divine power. Whether that power be an entity like God, whether it be things like the stars or the alignment of planets, or some other type of supernatural, in a sense, divine power. And this would be this, the theological determinism would be this sort of determinism, where things are preordained by a supernatural push, so to speak. It's very often associated with predestination in a number of religious traditions, where you have this deity or divine entities, therefore, that have set the course of the universe and individual lives. Determinism, therefore, in a sense, like we said, at least in theory, at least conceptually, can be predictable. We can somehow, at least conceptually, like I said, predict what will what the outcome will be, what the outcome is. And determinism per se, while it suggests that events can be predetermined, it does not necessarily imply this predictability. So you have a number of variables of complex of complex variables. There are limitations on human knowledge. There are limitations on how much we can compute. Even though computers have brought us a very long way into computing huge amounts of data in real time, still there are limits. There's a very real wall that we do not yet can go beyond. And this limit, this wall that I'm talking to, often makes predictions either difficult or impossible, especially in practice. Like I said, in theory, it's easy to say, but everything can ideally be known, can be predicted. But then in practice, there are limitations to how much we can know from before. This doesn't mean that this does not mean that not everything is determined. It still could be the case that everything is determined, that determinism is the not founding, but it's the one rule, so to speak, that impinges on events, on actions, etc. But there's a limit to how much we can predict. Determinism can be contrasted with indeterminism, and this would be the opposite of it, right? Indeterminism would be the opposite of determinism, and this, on the other hand, would hold that not all events are determined by some antecedent cause. As we know, when we do logic, we talk of antecedent and we talk of the consequent. The antecedent is that thing that comes with the if part of a clause. The cause would be the part that comes with the then part of the clause, antecedent and consequent. And therefore, indeterminism would tell you that not everything that happens has to happen because there's an antecedent. And this would start to, crack open the door a bit to allow in things such as free will. And there are areas in science which I'm not very familiar with, like quantum theory, for instance. And quantum theory seems to suggest as well that there is a certain element of indeterminism. Something else that I remember one of my professors talking about when I was doing philosophy at university, my undergraduate, was this experiment back in the early 2000s, apparently, where you had scientists dropping a drop of water in a controlled environment. Therefore, you're supposed, at least, to have all variables being equal, and somehow the splash made with subsequent drops of water, they clear it up and then they drop another one, was always different. So water seems to splash out always in different shapes. And this seems to be random. And it's an example of how you can have randomness in the universe despite having all variables under control, despite it being a controlled experiment where you are holding, you're trying to align the variables as close to each other as humanly possible. Now, A counter to that is that even if you had to repeat everything exactly, you weigh the water, you you polish the surface on which it splashes absolutely clean, and it's absolutely the same. There are certain variables you don't have control over. The one overarching variable is time. Perhaps time determines the shape of the splash as well, but even if conceptually you were able to control everything, time is the one thing you can't control. So you always have that one thing that changes from one experiment to the next. Determinism is also related to the philosophy of mind, especially when we talk, when we discuss the context of mind and consciousness, and therefore it raises questions. Determinism raises questions about thoughts, about feelings, about desires and ideas. Because if everything is determined, it seems to raise a question about why should we have dreams, for instance. Why should we have desires if we can't act on those desires? They say that there's a lot that seems superfluous. If you desire something, you desire it in order then for you to bend yourself towards acquiring it. But in a hard deterministic universe, in a hard deterministic cosmos, you can't possibly bend yourself. It would be an illusion. And when we talk of determinism within the context of philosophy of mind, the question arises, are these mental states, therefore things like thoughts and feelings and desires and emotions, are these mental states also determined by prior causes? And you have psychology, neuroscience, you have the philosophy of mind that discuss these things. The more we learn about how the mind works, the more of it seems to be determined. You have names within the philosophy of mind as well as neuroscience who are absolutely behind a deterministic view of the human mind. People like the Churchlands, for instance. It's a married couple. Anyways, then of course determinism raises questions about morality. There are moral considerations, there are ethical considerations that have to be taken when discussing determinism, when assuming everything is determined. Because if actions are predetermined, then can we, as individuals, supposedly with free will, can we be morally responsible for our actions? It seems like we take those actions, like we're responsible for those actions, but if we are being not just influenced but determined by outside forces, by external forces to ourselves, can we be held accountable for those? And this of course leads to discussions about the nature of free will and the nature of moral responsibility, etc. Now I'd like to go a little bit deeper and discuss determinism and determinism and human nature. Now, human nature has been acknowledged by some and denied by others. But when we talk of determinism in relation to human nature, it seems like if we have a determinist view, if we have a determinist position, if we hold such a position, then all aspects, all sides of human behavior, including decision making, including emotions or moral choices, like we said, like we mentioned, these are all the result of preceding causes. And there could be various causes for these. There could be biological causes, they could be environmental causes, or perhaps they could be even a combination of both biological and environmental. And in a sense, when we talk of human nature, or at least human action, nowadays it's often accepted that we talk of two main influencers there, spheres of influence: nature and nurture. And we'll go deeper into nature, and then we'll examine this a little bit deeper in a bit. But essentially, nature is those things like DNA, etc. Nurture is those things we are taught, or that we learn, that we pick up from the environment. And going back to, therefore, determinism, there is a biological side to determinism, and that would be, for instance, how genetics work, how genetics affect us. And you have psychological factors that affect how we perhaps act, that predetermine certain aspects of human behavior. You can have certain genetic predispositions, say, and these genetic predispositions influence personality traits. They can influence intelligence or even tendencies towards certain behaviors. It's interesting because a while ago, a few years ago now, but I was watching this documentary produced by one of the leading media houses, where it interviewed twins raised separately. Twins, therefore identical twins, therefore they had the same genes, but they were born in a family that had, it had its deficiencies, let's put it this way. And one of the kids was raised by the biological parents and living on the streets and making, the wrong sort of connections in life, unfortunately. The other one was adopted by another family, and given a better opportunities, etc. And genetically they were the same, right? The genes were the same. The one who grew up in the street grew up to become quite a criminal, in a sense. The other guy, the other fellow, the other twin, grew up to become a policeman. And this argument that he brought, the policeman guy, was that he did feel the same anger, possibly the same anger as his twin, but given the background, given the nurture he was given, he channeled that into something else, rather than stealing about pursuing thieves, for instance. So it's not a conclusive example, but at the same time, it's food for thought. So biological determinism has its weight. Environmental determinism has also its own weight, and with environmental determinism, the focus shifts on how external factors such as culture or social upbringing or education even can shape human behavior. They leave their mark on how we act. And environmental determinism, therefore, tells us that individuals' choices and actions are largely the product of the surroundings that we're in, the experiences that we go through. Now, going into the nature versus nurture debate, it concerns this difference between what we're given by nature and what we're given through nurture. And the debate is about which one is the most important. Whether it's the individual's innate qualities, those things we're born with, therefore nature, or it's those personal experiences that we go through, which is nurture. How do these determine or cause individual differences in our physical traits or our behavioral traits? Nature and nurture are seen as critical determinants. The weight that they carry is a critical one. When discussing nature and nurture, the debate sort of tries to understand how these factors can interact, perhaps. And perhaps one dominates the other. One is more dominant than the other in shaping us, in shaping how we behave. Is one stronger than the other? Are they equal? Now, let's talk a bit about ethical implications of determinism. And we've mentioned moral determinism. And moral responsibility comes, at least we assume, that it comes from us being autonomous. We can be held accountable, we can be held responsible if our decisions come from an autonomous place, an autonomous seat, a place that is not influenced or pushed or determined by external forces, by external determinants. And if actions therefore are predetermined, then we have to accept that the traditional understanding of moral accountability is then challenged. Now, you have philosophers like Daniel Dennett, for instance. Daniel Dennett has argued for a form of compatibilism, that you can bring determinism and free will together without not making sense. Of course, there are also, we'll go into further detail on compatibilism in a bit, but sticking a bit longer with ethical implications, there are legal and social consequences when you argue for a deterministic universe. If you understand criminal behavior through a deterministic lens, then this could lead to more emphasis on rehabilitation rather than punishment. And this is something we can notice nowadays. Contemporary society, by and large, not fully so, but by and large, contemporary society emphasizes rehabilitation more strongly than it did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Now it's about having a criminal who is given, who's rehabilitated, who's taught again, or for the first time in some cases, how to be a member of society. It's not about punishing people for what they apparently did. It's about changing things, changing traits in their personality and how they behave, so that they are better adapted to be a member of society. This, of course, raises its own set of questions. One of them, it's all well and good accepting that perhaps an amount of one's action has been determined by, say, the environment or peer pressure, etc. On the other hand, with the justice system, and if one seems to be all about rehabilitation, one can also be interpreted as forgetting a bit about a sense of justice from the victim's side. To have a sense of justice in society, one needs to keep in mind both, not just the criminal, now how do we fix this person, but also what will make the victim feel as if society recognizes that wrongs have been done. So again, it's a fine line to play between rehabilitation and punishment, because of course rehabilitation keeps the perpetrator in mind, but a sense of justice for the victim also means that the victim has to see that whoever hurt them is being punished back or hurt back, of course within the confines of the law, you know. But for centuries and millennia, we had different societies around the world had this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and justice was about punishment, not about rehabilitation. Nowadays, with advancements in psychology and neuroscience, etc., and even philosophy of mind, we better understand perhaps that there are factors external to the person, that free will is not that free as we initially imagined. At the same time, we still need to make sure that everyone feels satisfied with the judicial process. You know, we give everyone their due. In terms of ethical implications, determinism also has its questions about autonomy and ethics. It's about individual autonomy, because it challenges this notion that individuals therefore are the ultimate authors of their actions, they are the ultimate instigators of their own actions. And this of course has some very profound implications for ethical decision making, and even the concept of consent, for example. Because consent means I give my permission, but if that consent is not being freely given, and for consent to be freely given one has to have free will, then even the notion of consent starts to find itself on shaky ground. Can we talk of consent if the universe is determined? If everything is, if human action is determined? You know, if I give my consent to whatever it is, you know, it can be sexual things, but it can be even my consent to be photographed, for instance. My consent as a signature on a bank check, you know. But if I give that consent, but that consent is not being freely given, then I can be thought of as being coerced. And with coercion, we recognize that there is no consent. If someone signs off an admission of guilt, for instance, one has to assume that that admission was freely given. But then if you realize that there was someone was coerced to sign an admission of guilt, they were forced through torture, through threats, through whatever, then it is seen as not having been freely given. Therefore, it was not autonomous. Therefore, it was not free. You know, it was determined. And one can be coerced through someone else holding a gun to your head. But when we're talking of determinism, and that would be a determined way how to lose consent. But another way how to lose consent would be that we're just, you know, like puppets following our strings unconsciously, but it's still coercion at the end of it. So once again, the topic of determinism raises issues everywhere. It really is one of those topics that if one sticks to a hard type of determinism, then you start to find problems everywhere. very difficult problems to solve then, with everything, with consent, one of them, with autonomy, with moral autonomy, with artistic freedom, with creation, with being creative. Then it's, one thing leads to the next. Artistic freedom, whatever, everything. Now let's go further and start discussing the next part, which is human action and the laws of nature. There are positions in philosophy that claim that natural law, the laws of nature that is something to be applied also to human actions. And we see examples of this stretching back millennia at this point. Aristotle was one who held such a position. Natural law, the idea that there is a natural law, that reason, for instance, follows natural law, that logic has a foundation in natural law, the laws of logic, the laws of reasoning, the laws of argumentation, if you want to argue properly. As much as there are laws for gravity, there are also laws for human behavior. And as philosophy advanced, but also as our worldview advanced, and as you know by now, from the time of Aristotle, which would be considered classical philosophy, to nowadays, to the modern period, to the contemporary period, there have been different phases of thinking. And the latest phase, which is the modern phase, it has been going on for more or less 600 years now at this point. You had a huge shift coming when philosophers cum scientists started exploring the universe and trying to better understand our place in it. You had the Copernican revolution, which shifted us from the center of the universe, the center of everything, the center of the solar system, to a more marginalized position, and that was going against even what Aristotle claimed. Aristotle held that the cosmos was geocentric, the earth at the center, everything else goes around it. And the Catholic Church lapped this up. You had Thomas Aquinas back in the 1200s, who was an Aristotelian through and through. So when the church felt that it had to proclaim itself on everything under the sun and beyond, it also decided to proclaim itself, to make its position clear about the shape of the solar system, the shape of the universe, the orbits of the planets, what goes around what, etc. So it took this position following St. Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, that the earth was the center of everything that exists, and we occupy that space, that earth. Why? Because we're made in God's image, and being made in God's image means that we are the most important. You can't be the most important unless you're at the center. And if you're shuffled to some dark corner no one knows about, you can't really say you're an important person, or you have an important existence. Therefore, Aquinas, following Aristotle, thought, and following also the sacred texts of Christianity, etc., put us at the center of everything. Well, along come Copernicus and Galileo and others, and they remove us from that center. And this would mean it would be one of those first movements in Western society towards a scientific revolution. And science is so clean because it can be predicted. When you've done your experiments well, when you've done your studies well, then you can predict how nature will behave. And the more you learn, the more ahead you can predict, the more accurately you can predict. We still jest about the weather report, but with all its faults, weather reports now from weather reports 100 years ago, there's no comparison. Nowadays we know with relative accuracy what's going to happen up to a certain extent. This was unimaginable 100 years ago. Anyways, so thanks to advancements in science, also advancements in technology, advancements in computation, the sheer scale of computational power available. Anyways, but this is also a result of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution started feeding us this view of the cosmos as something that can be predicted. The way it works can be predicted. The way it will act, the way it will behave can be predicted. And this is like spelling out determinism for you. So the classical mechanics, classical physics, say, or chemistry, and even biology in a sense, laid the groundwork for a deterministic view of the cosmos, of the universe. Going off Newton, Newton would tell you that given complete knowledge of the physical state of a system at one time, it's possible to predict its state at any future time. And that is determinism. You have determinism even in modern physics. This is classical physics, right? Classical mechanics. Newton, 300 years ago. Einstein already, it's much closer to our age, it's much more contemporary, but still it's 100 years ago at this point. And transitioning therefore to modern physics, Einstein for instance, you have theories like his relativity, and you have broadly kept determinism, but then you start to increase complexities. You have relativity of simultaneity, for instance. And with Einstein, we start to see how a deterministic view of the universe is slowly getting questioned. It's slowly losing its foot, in a sense. It's a bit like what we had with the Copernican revolution. We start to see a shift even as quantum physics continues to evolve. I'm not very familiar with quantum physics, if I had to say. I'm not that knowledgeable into it. But one thing quantum physics seems to be showing is that not everything is as determined as we originally think. So then you have probabilistic elements that challenge this classical notion of determinism. You have things, therefore, that challenge determinism, and with the challenge to determinism, then we start to reintroduce a more friendly environment to autonomy, to free will. Perhaps indirectly, but that's the implication. Now let's examine a bit compatibilism. And when we talk of compatibilism, therefore, we're trying to make compatible determinism on one hand and freedom of will on the other. So you have this thing called the free will debate. For instance, the free will debate is a debate about the existence of free will. Does it exist or not? If it exists, how can it be coexisting with what we perceive as a deterministic universe? It's particularly interesting because nowadays we live broadly in a secular society that has done away with the supernatural. As you remember, God is dead and we've killed him, Nietzsche says in 1876. 150 years later, we are refining, in a sense. We're re-sparking an interest in things that go beyond purely physical things. So free will, as we know, is this idea that we have the capacity to make choices free from constraints, or at least from certain constraints. Determinism would tell you that everything is determined. You have preceding events. Now, compatibilism, therefore, has to walk a really tight rope there. It's telling you that they're not mutually exclusive. But how? How can they be not mutually exclusive? Because free will is simply the ability to act according to one's desires and motivation without coercion. Now, in some cases, those desires can themselves be determined by prior causes. But still, your free will for a compatibilist means that you are able to act according to your desires. Let me give you an example. So imagine you have someone who chooses to eat, I don't know, an apple over a cake. And the compatibilist, therefore the one who thinks both are possible, determinism and free will, would argue that if the person's choice aligns with their desire, then it is an act of free will. And that free will can, of course, that desire can, of course, be determined by prior causes. You can have the upbringing that determines what you like, or you can have genetic predispositions that you have. But as long as you manage to align your desires with your choices, or the other way around, your choices with your desires, then such compatibilists would argue that you have free will. You have, for instance, Daniel Dennett, which I've mentioned already, and Dennett is still alive. He's still active, very old at this point, but he's still active, and he argues in favor of a type of compatibilism. He has this book called Elbow Room, and in it he argues for a compatibilist view of free will. Hume is yet another example. David Hume in the 18th century. David Hume, who argued that the necessary connection between cause and effect doesn't negate human freedom. So there's a necessary connection between cause and effect, but that doesn't mean that you don't have human freedom, because human freedom lies in acting according to one's will without external constraints. But then again, he's aligning one's will with one's actions. As long as those actions follow one's wishes or one's will, then you can claim even if the cosmos, even if one has a deterministic view of the cosmos, then you can claim that you have compatibilism. Now, it doesn't come without problems. These views, both Dennett's and Hume's, have their set of objections. And if we claim that determinism is true and our actions are the consequences of law and nature, even if those, if those actions are events in the remote past, they're still being determined. So it's not really, let's say that you claim that, but right now my wishes and my actions are aligned. Why? Because my wishes were predetermined and my actions likewise were predetermined, but they happen to match. But it doesn't mean that you are making those actions follow your wishes. It doesn't mean that you are making your choices. If you have no option other than to choose what you've chosen, even if those choices, let's call them actions or events in your life, even if those events in your life match your wishes, therefore it seems like you're doing what you want to do, it's just a question that these have been aligned for you. You're not the one aligning them. You're not the one making them run along the same line. You're just doing, that's it. You're not doing what you want, or perhaps you're doing what you want, but you don't have any other option. And this is an argument we've discussed a bit last time when we were discussing God, and we said that one wonders if God is perfect, and perfection means that you always do the right thing. Can one claim that God has freedom if the only thing God can do is good? And it's interesting because then we can claim that God actually doesn't have freedom. God is not free. But if God is not free, at the same time we wonder what perfection means. Or at least in a religious discussion, in a theological discussion, one wonders why anyone would say that Eve's choice made us in God's image. Because Eve had a choice, God doesn't. As you know, the Genesis Garden of Evil story about finding knowledge by biting the forbidden fruit, and that knowledge suddenly opened their eyes. It made Adam and Eve more godlike. But more godlike means what? More perfect? Well, clearly not, because more godlike, if it gave them knowledge, it also gave them shame. Now, does God feel shame? One wonders, if God feels shame. If you're perfect, you need feel no shame, because shame comes with feeling perhaps humiliated or somehow at a loss compared to others, or somehow you have something missing or something less. This is what shame is about. So the idea that knowledge and freedom brings you closer to God, at the same time has its own issues, because God is perfect and doesn't seem to have a choice. You have others who argue that compatibilism seems to fail to align with our intuitive understanding of free will, and this intuitive understanding of free will involves being able to do otherwise than one actually does. Again, this intuitive feeling that we have, that we know what free will must be like. But free will seems to imply that you can do otherwise. And that's a critique of compatibilism. Because if compatibilism is in the form of your events, your choice and your wishes aligning, it leaves room for you just happening to have those in alignment. You don't have any other choice. So it's not really free. Let me give you an example of what a critic of compatibilism might say about smoking, for instance, or about an alcoholic, someone who's alcoholic. Let's say you have a smoker who willingly chooses to smoke, right? They have a desire, they have a smoke, they have a cigarette there, so the cigarette aligns with their desire, the access to a cigarette aligns with their desire, therefore one feels like they're free to do what they want to do. But or let's take an alcoholic, someone who's dependent on alcohol intake, one feels the need to have a drink, the bottle is there, you lead yourself towards the bottle, and you feel like you're doing it because you want to. But on the other hand, and these are backed by medical research and addiction research, etc. Your addiction, as a result, the addiction is a result of prior causes, right? So therefore the addiction compromises your free will. It's not just because you want to drink and you follow through with an action that follows that want, therefore you have free will. Otherwise addictions don't really exist. No one would call themselves I'm an addict. Why? Because everyone has free will, and true free will means that you can turn down whenever you want. But I mean, speak to an alcoholic, to any alcoholic, to a recovering alcoholic, that is, someone who wants to pull out, or a recovering drug addict, and they will tell you that they'd rather teetotal it. Once they're off it, no exceptions, because once they break that exception, it's incredibly hard to free will yourself to stop again. It takes an incredible amount of commitment. Now let's move on and discuss a bit some other things about free will. So let's discuss the implications of free will, or of determinism. So determinism as undermining moral responsibility. People, as moral agents, can be said that their actions can be held against the standards of morality. When we act, when we perform a moral action, that moral action can be held, can be compared to standards in society, or standards in some ethical code, for instance, or even against some sort of categorical imperative. And actions, therefore, if they match the standards of morality, one can be praised, if you rescue someone from drowning, people praise you, the hero, and they clap, On the other hand, we can also be blamed if we fail to match the ethical standards in society. If you steal someone's handbag, you receive blame, and of course you also receive a fine and a prison sentence, hopefully. But there are standards, and we're matched to that. There are standards of morality, standards of responsibility. So holding people against a standard of morality means that you're holding them morally responsible for their actions. If you're blamed or if you're praised, then it means that you could have acted differently. But what if you couldn't? If you were strapped to a chair, say, and then you can't be held responsible for not helping someone who's drowning. Say you're at the beach and your friends tied you to a chair as a joke. Meanwhile, someone's drowning over there. You can't move. You can't say, but you didn't, right? You didn't save them from drowning. There's nothing you can do. Therefore, you're not morally responsible. On the other hand, if let's say it was a child, right? On the other hand, if a child is drowning right next to you in the sea, it's not your child, someone else's child, but you can just easily reach out your arm, pull the child out, and that's it. Equally, you're being held morally responsible for your actions, but of course you're being praised for it. You're being called a hero. When we praise and when we blame, therefore, we imply that they, others, or ourselves could have acted differently. And since moral responsibility depends on free will, it makes no sense to blame or praise someone for their actions if you are a determinist. If free will is undetermined by determinism, therefore so is moral responsibility. No one takes responsibility for earthquakes, for instance. No one takes responsibility for tornadoes or volcanoes exploding. Determinism claims but that actions are just like natural events. They're causally determined. So no one ever is truly responsible morally for what they do, for that which they do. Now, I'd like to introduce the notion of ought and can. There's this thing called the implication, the view that ought implies can. And if there is something you ought to do, then you're able to do it. If there's something you ought to do, then you are able to do it. It's the view that ought implies can. If you ought to have acted differently, then you could have acted differently. And if you could not have acted differently, as determinism implies, then it makes no sense to say that you ought to have acted differently. You're neither to blame nor to praise. Now, compatibilism provides three options. It can accept that ought implies can, even though determinism is true. Ought implies can, even though determinism is true. It can argue that issues of determinism and ought implies can are irrelevant to moral responsibility. So, even though we are determined, it doesn't absolve us of moral responsibility. This is a hard one to defend. And the third point is that it can explicitly reject that ought implies can. So therefore, what this third point means is that the fact that a person cannot do anything, can't do anything else, like, since you don't have a choice, right? If the only thing you can do is this. So the fact that the person can't do anything else doesn't imply that they are not morally responsible. So let's go into some objections. So ought implies can is a view of free will that is a bit too weak, it seems. It's not enough for moral responsibility. It doesn't allow for moral responsibility, because not only do we need to say that we've acted differently, they had to choose differently, but also that they could have chosen differently. So it's not just that you could have acted differently, but you could have chosen to act differently. Please note perhaps it's a subtle difference here, but the difference between could have acted differently and could have chosen differently. Imagine a football, right, in a field, and the football can go wherever it's being kicked. It could go in the net, it could go outside the field, it could go into a corner, whatever. So it can act differently, but it's not a choice it makes. So the fact that there could be several options to make still doesn't give us free will, because it still implies, free will implies that you're determining yourself, you're deciding for yourself. No football decides for itself the exact trajectory that it will go. Or imagine if you're into tennis or whatever, or billiards, no ball decides for itself, makes its own mind, determines itself where it wants to go. The options are multiple, but it's always being acted upon by something else or someone else. So ought not necessarily implies can. Ought implies can is the argument that tries to make compatibilism viable. But like I said, if you take the example of a ball, right? Kultant, sometimes you watch a football game and you say, but that should have gone in, that should have gone in. It was such an easy penalty. Well, yeah, but it doesn't mean that the ball can do that. So it didn't. In fact, it didn't. So, the view that ought implies can, even, first of all, it's free will, it's too weak. But also, it's not enough for moral responsibility. You can't say that the ball is morally responsible for not having gone in. Someone else is, perhaps, or maybe the wind is, but, you can't put moral responsibility on something that takes one way, one street instead of another, if it's being acted upon. So not only do we need to say that they could have acted differently, had they chosen differently, but they also could have chosen differently. So determinism means that they could not have chosen differently. That is what determinism is about. Again, another argument against, another objection to ought implies can, is that ought does not imply can. We can try to justify moral responsibility in terms of the benefits that come from holding people responsible, right? We want more good actions and less bad ones. And our practices of praise and blame have causal effects. They cause people to act in some way or another. Through repeated praising, you can raise a child that acts in a certain way. Of course, not praising for everything. If they kick their friend, you don't praise them for it, for nothing. But so it's directed. You're trying to impart on them morality, moral acts. Moral actions. It's what Aristotle claimed about being virtuous. You follow the virtuous person. Through repetition, you make yourself virtuous. Through repetition. It's not just you do it once and suddenly you become virtuous. If you want to become a virtuoso violinist, You don't pick up violence once in your life, spend 45 minutes and suddenly you're Paganini. You have to spend 16 hours a day playing for 20 years and then you can call yourself the new Paganini. But this takes repetition and repetition and repetition. So this is what makes you virtuous. And some claim that through repetition you can bring up a person who is good. So in a sense you're determining them to be good. People enjoy praise, people dislike being blamed, so they will tend towards doing more praiseworthy actions and fewer blameworthy actions. So even if determinism were true, people would still perform more good actions if we do. And that's how you reintroduce morality into it, how you introduce an ethical dimension to it. Because then you can talk of good actions and bad actions, and people, through this process of making them, of forming them, it's a formative process, you will have better people. The objection, I think, seems to beg itself back in, because this is not really moral responsibility. Moral responsibility, once again, it's about autonomy. If I train my traffic lights by giving them the tools, that every time that an old person crosses the street, or a child crosses the street, I install them, I set up, it takes me time to install everything, but every time someone vulnerable crosses the street, these bars raise up and cars can't cross. If the car tries to drive through a zebra crossing, they get stopped. And the more they have some form of AI and they learn more how to recognize old people and very young children, and the more they repeat, the better they become. But can I say that this zebra crossing is morally responsible? Can I say that this has moral weight? I mean, the result has moral weight, but that itself, the zebra crossing itself, the pelican lights with the bars raising and, recognizing faces, can I say that this is a moral entity? Well, when we do the Chinese room experiment by Searle, we'll see how he describes computers as garbage in, garbage out. Now, of course, if you give it flowers, it will give you flowers back, hopefully. But there's a very basic limitation. Computers, according to Searle's Chinese room experiment, computers are not conscious. So the behavior of them, they can trick you. You can go on whatever it is nowadays, ChatGPT or Bing, and it seems to be knowing what it's doing. It seems to be cogitant. It seems to be reflecting on things, and it can come up with poetry and images and pictures and really convincing fake photos, etc. But at the end of it, does it know it's doing these things? Is it conscious of it? Is it agent in doing so? Does it have moral, creative, human agency? And if we follow the Chinese room experiment, then the answer is a clear no. But we will be doing the Chinese room experiment in a few weeks. We'll be covering that in a separate lecture when we do artificial intelligence and other things. So the objection, like I was saying, that does not imply can, etc., is that even though you're training someone to be a better person, to do better actions, you're not making them a better person. You're just making something or someone that performs better actions, but not as a better. They don't become more virtuous people by it. So morality, when we do this, and moral responsibility, have simply become a way to classify and control behavior. There's nothing intrinsically good about someone, it's just that they're programmed to perform this better than they probably would have. So, in a sense, it's no different from training robots or training animals. And the result would be therefore that people are not moral agents. So having mentioned animals, I'm sorry, I don't mean to say that at least some animals are not, can't be considered for moral agency, can't be candidates of moral agency, but by and large, most animals can be trained. But at the same time, I think few animals can be considered moral agents, that they have a distinct sense of what is morally right and morally wrong. That is a bit more questionable then, by and large. Although, if I had to be honest with you, and this is a confession, I think that morality, if it exists, also is a product of an evolutionary product. And it's not something that started to exist with human beings. I think you can see signs of it in other animals, because we share roughly more or less the same brain, and those things that allow for morality to develop in human beings are also present in other social, hierarchically social animals of a higher order. You see animals that behave like us, both in the good things and in the bad things. You see this in chimpanzees, you see this in dolphins, for example, you see this in elephants. Anyways, so here's one final thought I'd like to leave you with. If determinism is true and it is incompatible with free will, then no one ever freely chooses to be a determinist. I'm going to repeat it. So, if determinism is true, right, assume that determinism is true. And determinism is incompatible with free will. So, free will and determinism can't go together. Then no one possibly ever freely chooses to be a determinist. It's not like people say, but you know what, I think based on what I've read, I think I'm a determinist, and it's the most thing that makes sense to me, therefore I choose to be a determinist. The fact you're saying you choose to be a determinist, or it makes more sense, therefore you will be a determinist, still implies some sort of choice. It implies you're choosing to be a determinist, but you see the irony there, right? Because to make a judgment, to form a belief, these are also actions. They are, of course, they're not physical in the bodily sense actions, but they're actions in a mental sense. They are mental actions. And if determinism is true, then any beliefs that we have are also causally determined. We can't believe otherwise. If you happen to be a determinist, you happen to be a determinist. It's not a choice you made. And if this is the case, then we don't form our beliefs on the basis of rationality. You don't reason that determinism makes more sense, therefore that's what you should be. You can't do that. The whole idea of rationality, of reason, suddenly disappears, because reason implies that you can choose. You choose what makes most sense, right? That is what being rational means. You choose what makes most sense. You choose to argue in a valid way. You choose to argue in a sound way, based on learning. But you have that choice. You have that choice between being rational and irrational, between following your emotions or perhaps, having a short discussion with your emotions. I feel like crying right now, but it's not a good idea, for whatever reason. Or I feel like, slapping this idiot right now, but perhaps I shouldn't. You can't have these discussions, and you can't be rational. Being rational means choosing. That is a choosing process. You're constantly choosing. And Sartre, who disclaimed all talks of the supernatural, Sartre still held dear to rationalism, to rationality, to freedom. We are absolutely free, Sartre tells us, despite him being an absolute atheist. But he didn't discount rationality because he knew, he saw how incredibly difficult it would be to claim rationality, to claim ethics, to claim morality, and deny freedom. The implications of denying freedom, the implications of determinism, are so widespread, so catastrophic, that nothing seems to make sense. Not even your rationality itself makes any sense anymore. The idea of evidence. We choose based on evidence, no? If we want to call ourselves, intelligent people or whatever, cultured people, or open-minded, right? What does open-minded means? It doesn't mean going with the flow. Open-minded means being able to assess a wide range of options and then choosing what you think is best. But again, here comes the word choosing. So, if determinism is true, there's no such thing as reasoning. However, the arguments for determinism, show that there is such a thing as reasoning. Therefore, determinism must be false. And that brings us to a close today about determinism.